Imagine a man lying in a hospital bed, knowing he only has a few days left to live. His hands are weak. His voice is barely above a whisper. But his eyes are sharp, clear, and filled with something that looks less like fear and more like urgency. He calls his children close. He tells them to lean in. And then he says something that none of them ever forgot. Something so stunning, so specific, so chilling, that it was passed down from generation to generation, quietly, like a secret too dangerous to say out loud. What did he tell them? Why did he feel the need to say it only at the very end of his life? And why, more than 100 years later, does it still matter to you, sitting right here, right now, in the America of today? Stay right where you are. Because what you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a fairy tale. It is not something someone made up to get views. It is American history, documented, real, and almost completely buried. And by the time this story is done, you will understand why. You will understand who buried it, how they buried it, and most importantly, what they did not want you to know. Welcome to the Fear Sermon. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and give this video a like. Because the story you are about to hear is exactly the kind of thing this channel was built for. Truth, history, the things they do not teach you in school. Now let us begin. The year is 1913. The United States of America is at a crossroads. The country is growing fast. Factories are booming. Immigrants are flooding in from Europe. The railroads stretch from coast to coast. But underneath all that growth, something darker is happening. The wealthiest men in the country, the bankers, the industrialists, the men who control vast networks of money and credit, are quietly, carefully, methodically working to reshape the financial system of the United States of America. Not for the benefit of the people. Not for the workers. Not for the farmers or the small business owners or the ordinary citizens who built this country with their hands. No. For themselves, and the tool they are building, the instrument through which they intend to exercise permanent, unbreakable control over the American economy, is something that will come to be known as the Federal Reserve System. Now, most Americans today have heard of the Federal Reserve. Most people know it exists. They know it sets interest rates. They know it prints money. They have seen the building. They have heard the name of the chairman, but very few Americans, even today, truly understand what the Federal Reserve is, where it came from, who created it, and most importantly, why a handful of United States senators in 1913 were so horrified by it that they risked their careers, their reputations, and their futures to stand up on the floor of the United States Senate and scream as loudly as the rules of that chamber would allow, that this thing must not be allowed to happen. One of those senators was a man named Henry Cabot Lodge. Another was a man named Elihu Root. But the one whose story we are going to tell today, the one who went furthest, who said the most, who paid the highest price, and who told his family the most extraordinary thing on his deathbed, was a senator from Minnesota. A man of deep conviction and fierce intelligence. A man who understood banking and finance in ways that most of his colleagues did not. A man who looked at the Federal Reserve Act, read every word of it, and said, plainly and without hesitation, this is not a bank. This is a trap. This is a machine for transferring wealth from the many to the few, and I will not vote for it. Not today. Not ever. His name was Newt Nelson. And while his is not the only name attached to the opposition, his story, and the story of what he said before he died in 1923, is one of the most remarkable, most overlooked, and most important stories in the entire history of the American financial system. But before we get to the deathbed, before we get to the words that echoed through his family for generations. We need to understand what he was fighting against. We need to go back, way back to a cold, foggy night in November of 1910, on a private railcar somewhere in the marshes of Georgia, because that is where this story truly begins. Picture it, a private train. Heavy curtains drawn against the night. No reporters. No photographers. No public record. Just 9 men, some of the most powerful men in the United States, sitting together in secret for a meeting that none of them would publicly acknowledge for years afterward. The men on that train included Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. There was Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's firm. There was Paul Warburg, a banker who had recently immigrated from Germany and who was considered one of the greatest experts on central banking in the world. There was Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, which was the most powerful bank in New York. And there were others, all of them brilliant, all of them rich, all of them connected in ways that ordinary Americans could not even imagine. They were traveling to a private club on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. A club so exclusive that, at the time, it was said that 1/6 of the entire wealth of the world was represented by its members. And for 9 days, behind closed doors, with no public record and no outside observers, these men wrote the first draft of what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Why the secrecy? Why not just propose the bill openly? Why not let the public see what they were doing? Paul Warburg himself, years later, explained it plainly. He said that if it had become known that these particular men, these particular bankers, had gotten together in secret to design a new central bank, the American public would have rejected it immediately. Because the American public, at that time, had a deep and reasonable distrust of concentrated banking power. They remembered the panics. They remembered 1907, when J.P. Morgan himself had essentially decided which banks would survive and which would fail. They remembered the Gilded Age. They remembered what concentrated financial power looked like. And they did not want it. So the plan had to be disguised. It had to be dressed up. The word bank could not even be used. Instead, it was called a reserve system, instead of one central bank, which would have reminded people of the old Bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson had fought so hard to destroy. There would be 12 regional reserve banks spread across the country, which gave the illusion of regional independence and democratic distribution. The names on the bill in Congress would be Democrats, because the bankers knew that a bill written by Republicans, especially by Senator Aldrich, who was openly associated with Wall Street, would face too much resistance. So the bill was rewritten, repackaged, and presented by a Democratic congressman named Carter Glass, and Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, a progressive, a man who had campaigned against Wall Street influence, signed it into law. The irony was breathtaking. The very party that claimed to represent the common man had just handed the keys of the American financial system to the most powerful bankers in the world. And the men who understood this, the men who had read the bill carefully, who understood central banking, who had studied the history of such institutions in Europe, stood up and said so, loudly. Knute Nelson was one of them, and the words he spoke on the floor of the Senate in December of 1913, in the days before the vote, are words that deserve to be read and heard and remembered today. He said, and these are his words, recorded in the Congressional Record, that this bill would give the banking interests of this country a stranglehold over the financial life of the nation. He said it would concentrate power in the hands of a few private individuals operating largely beyond the reach of democratic accountability. He said it would allow those individuals to expand or contract the money supply at their discretion, which meant they could cause prosperity or depression, inflation or deflation, not according to the needs of the American people, but according to their own interests and desires. He said it was the most dangerous piece of legislation he had ever seen come before the Senate, and he voted against it. He was not alone, but he was in the minority. The bill passed the Senate on December 22, 1913, with many members already having gone home for Christmas, assuming nothing important would happen before the holiday. President Wilson signed it into law the very next day, December 23, 1913, and just like that, with most of the country distracted by the holiday season, the Federal Reserve System was born. Now, here is where the story gets truly interesting, because for the senators who voted against the Federal Reserve, the fight was not over when the bill passed. In some ways, it was just beginning, because they had to watch, year after year, as the very things they had warned about began to unfold. Knut Nelson watched as the newly created Federal Reserve began to exercise exactly the kind of control over the money supply that he had warned about. He watched as the banking system expanded credit rapidly in the years after 1913, flooding the economy with easy money, driving up prices and speculation. He watched the United States enter the First World War in 1917, a war that the Federal Reserve helped finance through the issuance of war bonds, a process that enriched the very banks that had created it. He watched the war end and the economy begin its strange, unstable dance through the early 1920s, with credit expanding and contracting in ways that seemed to benefit the banks more than the people. And through all of it, Knut Nelson kept speaking. He kept writing. He kept warning anyone who would listen. He was not a radical. He was not a lunatic. He was a United States Senator from Minnesota who had spent his career fighting for the interests of ordinary Americans. Farmers, workers, small business owners, against the concentrated power of the corporations and banks that were slowly, steadily, quietly tightening their grip on the American economy. By 1923, Nelson was old and sick. He had served in the Senate for nearly 3 decades. He had fought battles that most people today have forgotten. He had won some and lost others. But the loss of the Federal Reserve fight, the sense that on the single, most important financial question of his lifetime, the wrong side had won, that was the one that stayed with him. And so, in the spring of 1923, as he lay dying, he asked his family to gather around him. His children, his grandchildren, the people he loved most in the world, and he told them something. He had spent his life, he said, trying to serve the people of this country. He had tried to be honest. He had tried to tell the truth even when the truth was inconvenient or dangerous. He had tried to stand up against power when power was being used to harm ordinary people. And he had lost. On the most important fight of his life, he had lost. But he did not want them to think that the loss meant the fight was over, or that the truth had somehow disappeared because it had been defeated. He told them that the Federal Reserve was not what the American people had been told it was. He told them it was not a government institution in any meaningful sense. He told them it was a private system, controlled by private bankers, operating in the interests of private bankers, and that the American people had been deceived into accepting it by a combination of expert manipulation, political theater, and deliberate confusion. He told them that the power to create money, the most fundamental power in any economy, had been quietly handed over to a group of private individuals who were accountable to no one, elected by no one, and who could use that power to enrich themselves and impoverish everyone else. He told them that the depressions that would come, and he was certain they would come, would not be accidents. They would be, to some extent, the predictable result of a system designed to expand and contract credit in ways that served the banks. He told them that when times got hard, when people lost their jobs and their farms and their homes, they should remember who had designed the system that made those things possible, and they should not let their children forget. And then he said something that his family remembered word for word, because it was so unexpected, so direct, so shorn of the careful, measured language of politics and public life. He said, "They will call men like me liars and fools for generations, but the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful men want it buried. Remember what I told you. The day will come when the American people see this thing clearly. And on that day, I hope they have enough time left to do something about it." He died a few days later, April 28, 1923. He was 81 years old. Now, take a breath, because I need you to stay with me here. Because what I am about to tell you is the part of this story that connects 1913 to today. That connects a dying senator's warning to your life, your money, your future, and the world your children are going to inherit. Less than 7 years after Knut Nelson died, the thing he had warned about happened. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began, and what most Americans were told, and what most history books still say today, is that the Depression was caused by out-of-control speculation, by reckless behavior on Wall Street, by a failure of the private banking system that the Federal Reserve was supposed to prevent. But there is another version of events, a version that was spoken out loud, on the record, in official testimony, by some of the most credible financial experts and historians of the 20th century. And that version says something very different. Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, spent years studying the Great Depression, and his conclusion, published in his landmark book, A Monetary History of the United States, written with Anna Schwartz, was that the Federal Reserve had not failed to prevent the Depression. The Federal Reserve had caused the Depression, not through inaction, not through incompetence, but through a series of deliberate policy decisions that contracted the money supply by roughly 1/3 in the years between 1929 and 1933, turning a bad recession into the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Let me say that again, because I want you to really hear it. The Federal Reserve, the institution that was created, in part, to prevent financial crises, contracted the money supply during the worst financial crisis in American history. It took money out of circulation. It tightened credit. It allowed banks to fail when it had the tools to save them. It did the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. And as a result, millions of Americans lost their jobs, their savings, their farms, their businesses, their homes. Children went hungry. Families were destroyed. A generation was scarred. And who survived the Depression? Who came through it with their wealth and power not just intact, but in many cases enhanced? The largest banks, the most powerful financial institutions, the ones with access to Federal Reserve credit, the ones who could buy up assets, farms, businesses, properties, at Depression-era prices from desperate people who had no other choice. Now, I am not telling you this to make you angry. I am not telling you this to make you despair. I am telling you this because this is exactly what Knut Nelson warned about in 1913. This is exactly the mechanism he described, a system that could expand and contract credit at the discretion of private bankers, in ways that served private bankers at the expense of everyone else. And here is the thing that should make you stop and think very carefully. It did not stop in 1933. It has not stopped since. Look at 2008, The financial crisis. The banks had taken enormous risks with other people's money, with your parents' mortgages, with pension funds, with the savings of ordinary Americans. And when those risks blew up, when the whole thing collapsed, what happened? The Federal Reserve stepped in. It lowered interest rates to virtually zero. It created trillions of dollars out of thin air, a process called quantitative easing, and it used that money to buy up the toxic assets that the banks had created. It bailed out the same banks whose recklessness had caused the crisis in the first place. And what happened to ordinary Americans during this period? They lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their retirement savings. Millions of families were pushed into poverty. And then, after all of that, the Federal Reserve, the institution that was supposed to serve the public interest, handed billions of dollars to the very banks that had caused the crisis at essentially zero cost, while ordinary Americans got nothing. Not a bailout, not a direct payment, not even a meaningful apology. Some of those banks used that free money to buy back their own stock, enriching their executives and shareholders. Some used it to acquire smaller competitors, becoming even bigger, even more powerful, even more too big to fail. And the cycle continued. The rich got richer. The ordinary American got a longer commute, a lower wage, a higher credit card bill, and a thinner retirement account. Is that a coincidence? Is that bad luck? Or is it exactly what happens when you design a financial system to serve the interests of private bankers, and then hand that system the power to create and destroy money at will? Newt Nelson did not have the answer to that question, not because he did not know it, but because the answer was too dangerous in his time to say plainly in public. But he said it to his family, quietly, in a hospital room in Minnesota, a few days before he died. And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what it says about the state of American democracy in 1913, and maybe even today, that the most important truths about how power works, about who controls the money, about who benefits from the system and who pays the price, those truths could not be spoken in public. They could only be whispered, in private, in the dark, on a deathbed. Now, here is something that people do not often talk about when they discuss the Federal Reserve debate of 1913. They do not talk about the warnings that came from inside the system itself. Not just from skeptical senators, not just from progressive journalists, but from people who were part of the financial world. People who understood how it worked from the inside. One of the most remarkable of these warnings came from Charles Lindbergh Cistern, the father of the famous aviator, who was a Republican congressman from Minnesota at the time. Lindbergh had been watching the banking system for years. He had written books about it. He had given speeches about it. And when the Federal Reserve Act passed, he said something that was so blunt, so direct, so unambiguous, that it has been quoted and requoted by historians and economists ever since. He said that the Federal Reserve Act established the most gigantic trust on earth. He said that when the president signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. He said that the people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The day of reckoning. Those were his words. And he said them in December of 1913, less than 16 years before the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. Was that a coincidence? Was Lindbergh a prophet? Or was he simply a man who understood economics well enough to read the blueprint and see where it led? I will leave that for you to decide, but I want you to hold that question in your mind as I tell you the next part of this story, because the next part is about what happened to the people who kept warning, who kept speaking, who refused to be silent even after the bill had passed and the system was in place. Some of them were ignored. Some of them were marginalized. Some of them had their careers quietly ended, their funding cut off, their reputations attacked by newspapers and magazines that were owned by or dependent on advertising from the very banking interests they were criticizing. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is how power works. It was true in 1913. It was true in 1929. It was true in 2008. It is true today. Think about this. After the 2008 financial crisis, economists and financial journalists who had warned about the crisis in advance, people who had published papers, written articles, made public predictions about the instability of the housing market and the recklessness of the big banks, were not celebrated for being right. They were not given platforms. They were not put in charge of reform. Many of them were actively sidelined. The people who were put in charge of the government's response to the crisis were, in many cases, the same people who had been part of the system that caused it. Timothy Geithner, who became Treasury Secretary during the crisis, had been president of the New York Federal Reserve during the years when the risks were building. Larry Summers, who was a top economic advisor, had helped repeal regulations in the 1990s that many economists believe contributed to the crisis. And Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve during the crisis, had famously said in 2007, just before the crash, that the problems in the subprime mortgage market seemed likely to be contained. Not one of these men lost their jobs. Not one of them was held publicly accountable. Not one of them faced any meaningful consequence for being spectacularly wrong about the most important economic question of their time. Instead, they continued to be treated as experts, as authorities, as the people who knew best. And the ordinary Americans who had done nothing wrong, who had taken out mortgages they were told they could afford, who had saved in retirement accounts they were told were safe, who had trusted a system they were told was sound. Those people paid the price. Is this what Knut Nelson feared? Is this what he meant when he said that the day would come when the American people see this thing clearly, and he hoped they would have enough time left to do something about it? Maybe. But here is the question that really matters. The question that I want the Fear Sermon audience to sit with today and talk about, and think about, and maybe argue about in the comments below. The question is this: what do you do with this knowledge? Because here is the truth. And I mean this seriously. This is not the kind of information that is comfortable. It is not the kind of story that has a neat ending. It is not the kind of history lesson where you hear what happened, you feel bad about it, and then you go on with your day feeling informed. This is the kind of knowledge that, once you have it, changes the way you see everything. The way you understand your paycheck, the way you understand your mortgage, the way you understand why gas prices go up and down, why inflation spikes, why recessions happen, why some people always seem to come through financial crises richer than they went in, while most people come out poorer. And I know that is a heavy thing to carry. I know it is easier not to know. I know there is a reason why this kind of history is not taught in schools, not discussed in mainstream media, not mentioned by the politicians who appear on your television and tell you everything is fine and the experts are in charge, and you can go back to sleep now. But you cannot unknow what you now know. And that, I think, is the real legacy of Knut Nelson. Not the vote he cast. Not even the words he spoke in the Senate. But the fact that on the last days of his life, when he had nothing left to lose, when the political calculations and the career considerations and the fear of being called a crank or a conspiracist no longer mattered, when all of that fell away, What he chose to do was tell the truth. To the people closest to him, as clearly and as completely as he could. He chose truth over silence. He chose legacy over comfort. And he trusted that the truth, once spoken, would survive. Now I want to go a little deeper, because there is a part of this story that most people, even people who know about the Federal Reserve's history, do not fully appreciate, and that is the role of language, the role of words, the way that the architects of the Federal Reserve used words and framing and narrative to make something that was extraordinary and unprecedented and potentially dangerous seem normal and safe and necessary. Think about the name itself, the Federal Reserve System. Every word in that name is doing a specific job. Federal makes it sound like a government institution, but it is not. The Federal Reserve is a private institution. It is owned by its member banks. Its profits, after paying a dividend to member banks, go to the government. But that does not make it a government institution, any more than a defense contractor is a government institution, because it does work for the Pentagon. The word federal in the name is, in a very real sense, misleading. Reserve makes it sound prudent, conservative, responsible, like something that holds back, that saves, that protects. But in practice, the Federal Reserve has the power to do the opposite, to create money, to expand credit, to take on risk in ways that the word reserve does not suggest at all. And system, well, system is just a neutral word that sounds technical and organized. It does not tell you anything about who the system serves, or how it operates, or what its actual purpose is. Paul Warburg, one of the men on that private rail car in 1910, was a genius at this kind of language. He understood that Americans would never accept a European-style central bank if you called it a central bank. So you do not call it a central bank. You call it a reserve system. You spread it across 12 cities. You give it a veneer of regional independence. You make it look democratic when it is not. You make it look public when it is private. You make it look like a safeguard when it is, in many ways, an instrument of control. This is not ancient history. This is the playbook that powerful institutions have been using for over a century. And one of the reasons it works so well is that most people do not have the time or the background to read a complex financial bill and understand what it actually says. They rely on experts. They rely on authorities. They rely on journalists and politicians to tell them what things mean. And when those journalists and politicians are themselves embedded in the very system that is being described, when they are financially dependent on it, socially connected to it, ideologically aligned with it, the description you get is not neutral. It is not objective. It is shaped by those connections, whether anyone is consciously aware of it or not. Knut Nelson understood this. That is why he read the bill himself. That is why he spoke from his own analysis, not from talking points prepared by someone else. That is why he was willing to stand up and say what he actually thought, even when what he thought put him in direct opposition to some of the most powerful men in the country. And that, I think, is the lesson that resonates most deeply today. Not just the specific facts about the Federal Reserve, not just the history of 1913 or 1929 or 2008, but the underlying principle. The principle that power tends to obscure itself. That the more powerful an institution is, the more important it is to those who control it, that ordinary people not look at it too closely. And the most effective way to prevent people from looking closely is not to hide the institution. You cannot hide the Federal Reserve. It is too big. It has too many buildings and press conferences and official statements. But to make it seem too complicated, too technical, too boring, too far removed from ordinary life to be worth paying attention to, If you have ever felt that finance and economics are just too hard to understand, that you should leave those things to the experts, that the whole subject makes your eyes glaze over and your brain shut down, I want you to ask yourself who benefits from that feeling. Who wins when ordinary Americans check out of the conversation about money and banking and monetary policy? Who wins when the voters and the taxpayers and the citizens of this democracy decide that these things are above their pay grade and that they should just trust the people in charge? Not you, not me, not the farmers and workers and small business owners that Knute Nelson spent his life defending. Not any of the ordinary people who make up the vast majority of this country and who pay the price every single time when the system goes wrong. The people who benefit from your disengagement are the people who control the system. Because if you are not watching, they do not have to explain themselves to you. They do not have to justify their decisions. They do not have to worry about your opinion. They can do whatever serves their interests, and when the consequences land on your doorstep, when the inflation erodes your savings, when the recession costs you your job, when the housing bubble pops and takes your home equity with it, they will tell you it was complicated. They will tell you it was unavoidable. They will tell you that very smart people made the best decisions they could with the information they had, and they will tell you that you would not understand if they tried to explain it. Knute Nelson heard that kind of language in 1913. He did not accept it then, and I hope, that the audience of the Fear Sermon is not prepared to accept it now. So let us talk about what understanding this history actually means, practically, for the way you live your life and the way you engage with the world. It means understanding that money is not a neutral tool. Money is power, and the rules that govern how money is created, who controls it, who can access it, and on what terms, those rules are not natural laws. They are political choices. They were made by people. They can be changed by people. They were changed dramatically in 1913, and they have been adjusted and modified ever since, always by people, always reflecting specific interests and specific power relationships. It means understanding that inflation, which most Americans experience as a kind of weather, something that happens to you, something outside of your control, is partly a policy choice. When the Federal Reserve prints money, it dilutes the value of the money you already have. Your savings, your wages, your retirement account. They all lose purchasing power when the money supply expands faster than the economy grows. And who tends to be hurt most by inflation? People who hold their wealth in cash and wages. Who tends to be least hurt? People who hold their wealth in assets. Real estate, stocks, commodities. Things that tend to rise in price along with inflation. The rich, in other words, have a natural hedge against inflation built into the way their wealth is structured. The poor and middle class do not. It means understanding that interest rates, which most people think of in the context of their mortgage or their car loan, are actually one of the most powerful tools of economic management in existence. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it becomes more expensive to borrow money. That slows down the economy. Businesses invest less. People buy fewer homes and cars. Some businesses fail. Some people lose their jobs. That is not a side effect. That is the mechanism. That is how it is supposed to work. According to mainstream economic theory, the Federal Reserve deliberately causes people to lose their jobs in a controlled, managed way in order to slow down inflation. It calls this cooling the economy. But for the person who gets laid off, it is not a controlled, managed experience. It is a catastrophe. It means understanding that the decisions about when to raise and lower interest rates Decisions that affect the employment, the purchasing power, the economic security of hundreds of millions of Americans are made by a committee of 12 people, most of them appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, serving 14-year terms. Not elected, not directly accountable to voters, meeting in private, deliberating in private, releasing only limited information about their discussions. Operating, in Woodrow Wilson's own words he spoke after he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, in a moment of apparent regret, like an invisible government. Those were Wilson's own words. Invisible government, not necessary safeguard, not prudent institution, invisible government. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because I know that some of you are thinking, okay, this is interesting, this is disturbing, but is it really as simple as a group of bankers took over the money supply and everything bad that has happened since is their fault? And the answer is no, it is not that simple. The world is never that simple. Monetary policy is genuinely complicated. Central banking is a difficult and imprecise science. The Federal Reserve has done things over the past century that most economists would say prevented worse outcomes, including, probably, preventing the 2008 crisis from becoming another Great Depression. But here is the thing. The fact that something is complicated does not mean that we should not try to understand it. The fact that monetary policy is genuinely difficult does not mean that the people who control it should be unaccountable. The fact that central banking requires expertise does not mean that expertise should be wielded exclusively in the interests of the banks that created the system in the first place. The question is not whether the Federal Reserve should exist. The question is not even whether central banking is good or bad. The question, the real, deep, fundamental question that Knut Nelson was asking in 1913, and that we should still be asking today, is, who does this institution serve? In whose interests does it operate? When it has to make a choice between protecting the financial system and protecting ordinary Americans, which does it choose? And the historical record, not conspiracy theory, not speculation, but the documented, publicly available historical record, suggests that the answer to that question is more complicated than we have been told, and more troubling than most people realize. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was sold to the American public as a tool for stabilizing the economy, preventing panics, and ensuring a healthy money supply for a growing nation. Less than 20 years later, by the analysis of a Nobel Prize-winning economist, it had caused the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Less than 100 years later, it had presided over a financial crisis in which the banks it was supposed to regulate had nearly destroyed the global economy, and its response was to bail out those banks while ordinary Americans bore the consequences. That does not mean the Federal Reserve is evil. It does not mean that the people who work there are villains. It does not mean there is a room somewhere with a map and a plan and a group of men in suits laughing about how well things are going for them. Human institutions are not that neat. They are not that organized. But human institutions do reflect the interests of the people who design them and the people who control them. And when an institution is designed by private bankers, controlled largely by private bankers, and operates in an environment where the most powerful voices shaping its decisions are those of private bankers, the outcomes of that institution will tend, over time and across many different circumstances, to favor the interests of private bankers. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how institutions work. That is just how power works. And understanding how power works, really understanding it, clearly and honestly, is the first step toward changing it. Knut Nelson knew this. Charles Lindbergh knew this. The men who stood up in the Senate in December of 1913 and voted no. Not because they were unsophisticated or ignorant, but because they had read the bill and they understood exactly what it meant. They knew this, and they said so. And then they were ignored. And then they were forgotten. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful men want it buried. That is what a dying man said to his family in a hospital room in Minnesota in 1923. And 100 years later, more or less, here we are, talking about it, learning about it, asking the questions he wanted us to ask, making sure his warning did not disappear completely into the silence that power always tries to impose on truth. And I want to say one more thing before we close, because I think this is important, and it is something that the Fear Sermon tries to do in every video we make. I do not want you to walk away from this story feeling powerless. I do not want you to feel like the game is rigged and there is nothing you can do and the best strategy is to just give up and let the powerful people do whatever they want. Because that feeling, that despair, that cynicism, that sense of helplessness is itself a tool of control. When you feel like nothing you do matters, you stop doing things. You stop voting, you stop organizing, you stop asking questions, you stop holding institutions accountable. And that is exactly what the people who benefit from the status quo want you to do. The alternative is knowledge, understanding, paying attention, asking the questions that powerful people do not want you to ask, reading the documents they would rather you did not read, talking to each other about the things they would prefer to remain unspoken. That is what Knut Nelson did. That is what the opponents of the Federal Reserve Act did in 1913, even after they lost. That is what a long tradition of Americans, farmers, workers, journalists, politicians, ordinary citizens, have done in the face of concentrated power throughout the history of this country. And it matters. Even when it does not win immediately, even when the bill passes and the system gets built and the warnings get buried, it matters because truth accumulates, because understanding spreads, because the conversation that seems to go nowhere in 1913 becomes the foundation for a question that gets asked in 1929, and again in 2008, and again today, until finally enough people understand enough of the reality, clearly enough to do something about it. We are not at the end of this story. We are somewhere in the middle of it. And the choices that people like you, people who seek out this kind of history, who want to understand how power really works, who are willing to sit with difficult and uncomfortable truths. The choices you make about what to do with this knowledge, about how to engage with the world around you, about what kind of country you want to live in and what kind of future you want to leave to your children. Those choices matter, more than you might think. So share this video. Share it with someone who you think needs to hear this story. Someone who has been told their whole life that economics is too complicated to understand, that they should just trust the experts, that the people in charge are doing their best and there is nothing to worry about. Show them that the questions they always kind of sensed but never had the words for. The questions about why it always seems like the rich get richer and everyone else struggles. Those questions have answers. Real ones, historical ones, not conspiracies, not fairy tales, facts. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me if this changed how you see something. Tell me what you already knew and what surprised you. Tell me what you want to understand better. Tell me what you think we should cover next. Because this channel exists because of you. The Fear Sermon exists because people like you want to understand the world they actually live in, not the world they have been told they live in. And that desire, that hunger for truth, is itself a kind of power. Do not underestimate it. One more thing before I let you go. There is a historian, a man who spent decades studying the Federal Reserve and the American banking system, who once said that the secret of the success of the Federal Reserve's original architects was not that they were smarter than everyone else, or more powerful, or more ruthless. It was that they were patient. They understood that you cannot change a country's financial system overnight. You do it slowly, incrementally, one bill, one regulation, one policy decision at a time. You dress each change in the language of stability and responsibility. You make sure the right people are in the right places. And you wait. Because the people who benefit from the current system are always more motivated, more focused, and more patient than the people who are harmed by it. The people who are harmed by it are too busy working, too busy surviving, too busy just trying to make it through the week to spend years studying monetary policy and lobbying Congress and placing their allies in key positions. That asymmetry, that gap between the focus and resources of concentrated power and the diffuse, distracted attention of ordinary people, is the fundamental challenge of democracy. It has been the challenge since the beginning. It is the challenge today, and it is the challenge that Knute Nelson, lying in that hospital bed in 1923, was pointing at when he told his family that the day would come when the American people see this thing clearly, and he hoped they would have enough time left to do something about it. Do we have enough time? I honestly do not know, but I know that time is shorter when you do not know what you are looking at, and a little longer when you do. You now know a little more than you did when this video started. That matters. This has been the Fear Sermon. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. That means more than you know, and it tells us that this kind of deep, honest, historically grounded storytelling is what you came here for. We will keep making it, but only if you stay with us. So subscribe if you have not already. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And most importantly, share this. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Because the truth only survives when people pass it on. We will see you in the next one.